There's something about mountains that calls to us in the deepest part night, when a world grows quiet and our thoughts begin to wander toward places we've never been but somehow remember. Tonight, I want to tell you about one such mountain. A place where dreams gather like morning mist in hidden valleys, where ancient stones hold the memory of 1,000 peaceful slumbers, where time moves differently and the very air whispers of rest that runs deeper than bone. Close your eyes, settle into the comfort of your bed, and let me guide you to the lonely mountain, where a gentle soul once walked beneath starlight, seeking not gold or glory, but something far more precious, the perfect, eternal rest that lives at the heart of all things. This is a tale meant for drifting, a story that flows like a gentle stream through meadows of sleep, meandering through landscapes of the imagination where every word is chosen to soothe rather than startle, to embrace rather than excite. You don't need to follow every word. Let them wash over you like waves on a distant shore. Each phrase a stepping stone that can carry you deeper into tranquility if you wish, or simply background music for your own journey into dreams. If sleep takes you before the journey ends, the mountain will still be there in your dreams, waiting with its ancient patience, its halls echoing with the footsteps of all who have ever sought peace in the deep places of the world. This Hobbit-like wanderer will walk his moonlit path whether you're listening or dreaming, and his peace will become your peace, his rest your rest. His discovery of home in unexpected places a map for your own heart's navigation toward stillness. So breathe deeply. Let your shoulders sink into softness. Release the tensions of the day, like leaves falling from an autumn tree, and step with me onto the path that leads to the lonely mountain. The journey is long enough for the deepest sleep, gentle enough for the most tender dreams, and filled with the kind of wonder that makes rest feel like the most natural thing in all the world. In a valley where the grass grew thick as the finest velvet, and the evening air tasted of honeysuckle and distant rain and something else, something like the memory of childhood summers when time moved differently, there lived a soul who had never quite fit the mold of ordinary days. His home was a marvel of curved doors and circular windows, built into a hillside that rolled like a green wave frozen in time, its rooms flowing one into another with the organic grace of something that had grown rather than been built. Copper kettles gleamed on wooden shelves that had been polished by generations of careful hands, and books lay open beside chairs that seemed to cradle you like old friends, their pages marked with pressed flowers for meadows that existed only in stories. The walls were painted in shades of cream and butter yellow, colors that held sunlight even in the depths of winter, and every surface seemed designed for comfort rather than show. Quilts hung over chair backs, their patterns telling stories of long-ago harvests and celebrations, of hands that had worked love into every stitch. The windows looked out on gardens where vegetables grew in companionable rows beside flowers that had no purpose except beauty, where fruit trees spread their branches like open arms and herb beds released their fragrance into air that always seemed to smell faintly of baking bread and honey and the green contentment of growing things. But for all its warmth, for all its invitation to contentment, for all the ways it seemed designed to hold a soul in perfect satisfaction, this cozy haven couldn't quiet the restlessness that lived beneath his ribs like a sleeping bird that occasionally stirred and reminded him that there were skies meant for soaring. It wasn't dissatisfaction exactly, nothing so harsh or demanding. Instead, it was more like a gentle current that ran beneath the surface of his days, a whisper that spoke of horizons he had never seen and paths he had never walked, of mountains that held secrets and valleys where the light fell differently than anywhere else in all the world. Each evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of lavender and gold and the particular blue that exists only in the moments between day and night, he would step outside his round door and perform a ritual he had never named but never failed to observe. The evening air would wrap around him like a familiar embrace, carrying the scent of jasmine from the garden, and would smoke from distant chimneys and something else, something that came from farther away. The mineral smell of stone and the green freshness of places where water ran over rocks that had never known the touch of human hands. He would walk to the edge of his garden, where the tame gave way to the wild, where the carefully tended flowers yielded to grass that grew as it pleased and trees that followed their own ancient patterns of growth and rest. There, beyond the rolling fields and whispering trees, beyond the places where maps grew uncertain and paths became possibilities rather than certainties, beyond the comfortable boundaries of the known world, rose the silhouette of the lonely mountain. It stood against the horizon like a gentle giant, neither threatening nor welcoming, simply present, a fact of the world that seemed to hold secrets in its stone heart, stories written in languages of wind and weather and the slow, patient passage of seasons. The mountain never changed, never moved, never gave any sign that it noticed his nightly vigil or cared about the small figure that stood at the edge of a garden and gazed across the distance with eyes full of unnamed longing. Yet something in its stillness spoke to the quiet ache in his chest, the feeling that somewhere beyond his comfortable life lay a peace he had never known. Not the peace of a full belly or a warm fire, not the contentment that came from safety and routine and the small pleasures of a well-ordered existence, but something deeper, the peace that comes when you finally understand why you were born to wander, why some souls are made for seeking rather than settling, why the horizon calls to certain hearts with a voice that cannot be ignored or forgotten. The mountains seemed to change with the light, sometimes appearing blue as deep water, sometimes purple as shadows, sometimes gray as storm clouds, and sometimes, in a moment just before full darkness fell, seeming to glow with an inner light that had nothing to do with the sun or moon, but came from somewhere within the stone itself. On clear nights, he could see snow on its distant peak, white as starlight and just as mysterious. And he would wonder what it would feel like to stand in that high place where the air was thin and clean and the world spread out below like a map of all possibilities. Tonight felt different from all the others, charged with a quality he couldn't name, but recognized in the way animals know storms are coming long before the first clouds appear. Tonight, as the first stars pricked the darkening sky like tiny lanterns hung by invisible hands, the mountains seemed to shimmer slightly, as if it were breathing, as if it were finally ready to reveal whatever secret it had been keeping through all these years of patient watching. The evening breeze carried a scent he couldn't name, something like pine and crystal streams and the deep coolness of stone halls that had never known sunlight, something that spoke of spaces so vast that sound became music and silence became presence. His feet, as if acting without consultation from his mind, carried him down the garden path with its familiar stones worn smooth by years of walking, through the gate with its cheerful squeak that he had never bothered to oil because its voice had become part of the music of home, and onto the winding road that led away from everything he had ever known. The mountains seemed to change with the light, sometimes appearing blue as deep water, sometimes purple as shadows, sometimes gray as storm clouds, and sometimes, in a moment just before full darkness fell, seeming to glow with an inner light that had nothing to do with the sun or moon, but came from somewhere within the stone itself. On clear nights, he could see snow on its distant peak, white as starlight and just as mysterious. And he would wonder what it would feel like to stand in that high place where the air was thin and clean and the world spread out below like a map of all possibilities. Tonight felt different from all the others, charged with a quality he couldn't name, but recognized in the way animals know storms are coming long before the first clouds appear. Tonight, as the first stars pricked the darkening sky like tiny lanterns hung by invisible hands, the mountains seemed to shimmer slightly, as if it were breathing, as if it were finally ready to reveal whatever secret it had been keeping through all these years of patient watching. The evening breeze carried a scent he couldn't name, something like pine and crystal streams and the deep coolness of stone halls that had never known sunlight, something that spoke of spaces so vast that sound became music and silence became presence. His feet, as if acting without consultation from his mind, carried him down the garden path with its familiar stones worn smooth by years of walking, through the gate with its cheerful squeak that he had never bothered to oil because its voice had become part of the music of home, and onto the winding road that led away from everything he had ever known. The air grew cooler as he climbed, but it was the coolness of relief rather than discomfort, filled with the green scent of growing things and the mineral smell of stone touched by centuries of rain, and the particular freshness that comes from places where the earth breathes freely and the sky presses close enough to whisper secrets. Night birds called to each other across the darkness, their voices like liquid silver poured over velvet, creating conversations in languages that predated words and touched something deeper than understanding. Somewhere in the distance, water ran over rocks with the patient persistence of time itself, and he realized he was no longer just walking toward the mountain. He was walking into a story that had been waiting for him all his life, a tale that had been rehearsing itself in the movements of wind through grass and the rhythm of seasons turning and the slow dance of stars across the vast darkness of space. The road led him into a forest that seemed to exist in the space between waking and dreaming, where moonlight filtered through leaves like liquid starlight, and every shadow held the possibility of wonder. The trees were ancient here, their trunks wide enough to hollow into houses, their bark bearing the scars and stories of centuries, their branches interwoven overhead like the vaulted ceiling of a cathedral built by time and rain and the patient cooperation of growing things that understood how to share space and light and the subtle music of wind through leaves. Yet there was nothing forbidding about this woodland darkness. Instead, it felt like walking through the gentle thoughts of something vast and benevolent, something that had watched over this place for so long that its presence had become woven into the very fabric of bark and leaf and loam. The forest breathed around him with a rhythm so slow and deep it was more felt than heard, a pulse that seemed to sync with his own heartbeat until he couldn't tell where he ended and the woodland began. Fireflies danced between the branches like escaped stars, their cold light creating patterns that seemed almost like writing, as if the forest were trying to tell him something in a language of luminescence, spelling out messages in an alphabet of light that flickered just beyond the edge of comprehension. Some of the fireflies seemed larger than others, their glow steadier and more purposeful. And as he watched, he began to suspect they were not insects at all, but something else entirely. Messengers perhaps, or guides, or simply the visible manifestation of the forest's welcome. The trees themselves seemed to hum, not audibly, but in a way he felt in his bones, a deep vibration that resonated with the rhythm of his own heartbeat and breathing. It was as if the forest were a vast musical instrument being played by the wind, each tree a different note. The whole composition creating harmonies that existed below the threshold of normal hearing, but above the level of ordinary understanding. Moss grew thick on the northern sides of trunks, soft as sheep's wool and glowing faintly with its own inner light, creating patches of bioluminescence that marked the path as clearly as any painted sign. A stream appeared beside the path, its water so clear it seemed like liquid crystal touched with moonfire, running over stones that had been polished to perfection by countless years of patient flow. The sound it made was not the busy chatter of water in a hurry, but the deep murmur of something that had learned to take its time, to savor each curve and pool and gentle cascade. He knelt beside it and cupped the water in his hands, tasting the minerals of deep earth and the sweetness of mountain snow that had never known the warmth of summer, water that seemed to carry in its very essence the memory of clouds and rain and the long journey from sky to stone stream. The water seemed to wash away not just thirst, but something deeper, the accumulated dust of ordinary days, the weight of small worries that had clung to him like cobwebs, the residue of all the times he had forgotten to notice beauty or failed to appreciate the small miracles that surrounded him every day. When he stood again, he felt lighter, as if the stream had reminded him of who he was beneath all the things he thought he needed to be, beneath all the roles and responsibilities and expectations that had layered themselves over his true nature like sediment settling on a clear pool. The forest path meandered with the unhurried wisdom of water finding its way to the sea, following contours that made sense to forces older than human planning. Sometimes it climbed over gentle rises carpeted with pine needles that released their resin scent under his feet, filling the air with the Christmas tree fragrance of evergreen forests. Sometimes it dipped into hollows where ferns grew tall as his waist, and the air tasted of green shadows and patient time, where mushrooms glowed with their own faint phosphorescence and flowers bloomed that existed nowhere else in all the world. Always, the trees seemed to lean in slightly, not crowding or threatening, but offering their presence like old friends walking alongside him in comfortable silence. Their leaves whispered overhead with voices too soft to understand, but too persistent to ignore, creating a constant susurrus of communication that felt less like language than like breathing made audible. Occasionally, he would catch glimpses of movement in his peripheral vision, not threatening, never that, but alive in ways that daylight never revealed. He began to notice that the forest was not empty of life, but full of it in ways that spoke of a different kind of existence than the busy scurrying of daytime creatures. Small shapes moved in the underbrush with the careful grace of those who understood that darkness was not the absence of light, but simply another kind of illumination, another way of seeing and being seen. An owl called from somewhere overhead, its voice like a question posed to the night itself, deep and resonant, and filled with the wisdom of creatures that had learned to navigate by sound and instinct and the subtle variations in darkness that marked the difference between safe passage and danger. Another owl answered from the opposite direction, and then another, until the forest filled with a conversation in languages older than human speech, a dialogue of hunters and hunted, and those who had learned to exist peacefully in the spaces between. The calls seemed to follow a pattern, a rhythm that suggested meaning beyond the simple exchange of territorial claims or mating invitations. It was as if the owls were discussing his passage, commenting on this unusual traveler who walked their domain with respect rather than fear, who moved with the careful attention of one who understood that he was a guest in their ancient halls. The path began to widen gradually, the trees stepping back like courtiers making way for royalty, and ahead he could see open skies shot through with silver where the moon had risen higher and brighter, casting the world in that peculiar luminescence that makes everything look both more and less real than it appears in daylight. The forest had been preparation, he realized, a gentle transition between the world he knew and the world he was about to discover, a chamber of decompression where the rules of ordinary reality could slowly give way to the different physics of dream and story, and the kind of journey that changes the traveler as much as it reveals the destination. As he stepped from beneath the final canopy of leaves, the lonely mountain revealed itself in its true majesty. Not the distant silhouette he had gazed at from his garden for so many years, but a presence that filled the northern horizon like a sleeping god made of stone and starlight, so vast that looking at it required him to tilt his head back until his neck ached, so imposing that he felt like an ant contemplating a cathedral, so beautiful that something in his chest opened like a flower, that had been waiting its entire existence for this particular moment of blooming. The mountain rose from the earth in layers of stone that caught and reflected the moonlight, creating patterns of light and shadow that seemed to shift and change as he watched. What had appeared from a distance to be uniform gray revealed itself to be painted in subtle shades of blue and purple and deep green, colors that shifted with the light like oil on water, like the inside of an abalone shell, like the aurora borealis made solid and eternal. Snow crowned its peak like a crown of stars, and the sight of it filled him with a longing so pure and wordless that he understood for the first time why mountains had always been considered the dwelling places of gods. Between him and the mountains stretched a river wide as a lake, its surface so still it might have been polished obsidian, so perfect in its reflection that for a moment he couldn't tell where the sky ended and the earth began. It was as if he stood at the edge of infinity, looking down into another universe where different constellations wheeled through alien nights, where the mountain existed not as stone, but as pure idea, as the crystallized essence of all seeking and all finding and all the peace that waited at the end of every true journey. The mountain's reflection in the water seemed somehow more real than the mountain itself, more accessible, more intimate, as if the river were a window into the world where all dreams eventually gathered, where all the stories ever told converged into one great narrative of souls seeking home. The water lapped against the shore with the gentlest of sounds, barely more than breathing made audible, and he realized that this vast expanse was not an obstacle to be crossed, but another threshold to be honored, another pause in the journey that allowed transformation to settle into his bones. He settled on the bank where smooth stones had been worn round by countless years of gentle lapping, their surfaces polished to the texture of silk by the patient attention of water that had learned the art of persistence without aggression. The grass here was softer than any he had ever felt, starred with tiny flowers that glowed like captured moonbeams, their petals translucent and cool to the touch, releasing a fragrance like honey mixed with starlight when he brushed against them. As he gazed into the water, the reflections began to shift and change, and he realized he was seeing not just the mountain and stars and his own face looking back at him, but other things, glimpses of other travelers who had sat in this very spot, other seekers who had gazed into these same waters and seen visions of their own journeys. The water became a window into time itself, showing him that he was part of a procession of souls that stretched back through history, each one drawn by the same mysterious pull, each one seeking their own version of the peace that lay hidden in the heart of stone. There was a dwarf with a beard like spun silver, his eyes holding the deep patience of one who understood that the best treasures were found not in rushing, but in the careful attention to each moment, each breath, each small step of a journey that was as much about the walking as the arriving. His hands were broad and calloused from years of working with stone, but his touch was gentle as he ran his fingers through the water, and his smile was the kind that came from deep contentment rather than passing pleasure. An elf passed through the reflection, her movements like poetry written in the air, her song creating ripples that spread across the water like visible music. She was neither young nor old, but timeless in the way of growing things that understood the rhythm of seasons, the patience required for true beauty to unfold. Her hair moved in wind that touched nothing else, and her voice carried harmonies that seemed to come from the earth itself, from the deep places where roots touched stone and water flowed through darkness toward distant light. A tall man from the southern lands appeared, his dark skin marked with symbols that seemed to shift in the starlight like living tattoos, his smile carrying the warmth of deserts and the wisdom of ancient cities where knowledge was treasured more than gold. His clothing was woven with threads that caught the light in unexpected ways, and small bells sewn into the fabric chimed with each movement, creating music that spoke of markets filled with spices and stories, of caravans that carried more than goods from place to place, of roads that connected not just cities but hearts and minds and dreams. Each figure in the water seemed to nod to him across time, acknowledging the kinship of all who had been called by the mountain's silent summons, recognizing in him the same hunger for something beyond the ordinary, the same willingness to leave comfort behind in pursuit of a peace that could not be bought or borrowed or stolen, only found in the deep places where the soul remembered its true nature. The realization filled him not with disappointment at discovering that his journey was not unique, but with profound comfort, the understanding that he was part of something larger than his own small seeking, part of a pattern as old as the mountain itself. The sound of footsteps on stone made him turn, and there they were, the very companions he had glimpsed in the water's reflection, approaching along the riverbank as if they had been walking toward this meeting for years, as if they had known all along that this night, this place, this moment would bring them together. The dwarf's boots rang against the stones with the steady rhythm of a blacksmith's hammer, each step announcing his presence to the night with the confidence of one who belonged wherever he chose to walk. The elf moved with barely a sound, her feet finding the spaces between pebbles as if the earth itself shifted to accommodate her passage, as if the stones rearranged themselves to provide the smoothest path for her dancing steps. The southern traveler's approach was marked by the soft chiming of small bells woven into his clothing, their music like distant wind chimes touched by evening breezes, like the sound of temple bells calling the faithful to prayer, like the gentle percussion that accompanies the most beautiful dreams. His stride was long and unhurried, covering ground with the efficiency of one who had learned to walk great distances without exhaustion, who understood that the journey was not a race to be won, but a dance to be savored. They gathered around him without words of introduction, as if they were old friends meeting after a long separation rather than strangers encountering each other for the first time. There was no awkwardness, no uncertainty about how to begin or what to say. Instead, there was the immediate recognition that sometimes occurs between souls who are meant to journey together, who have been walking parallel paths that were always destined to converge at this exact moment in this exact place. The dwarf produced a leather pouch from the folds of his traveling cloak, its surface worn smooth by years of handling, marked with symbols that seemed to shift in the moonlight. From this pouch, he drew objects that seemed to glow with their own inner light. Not the harsh glare of fire, but the soft radiance of stones that had absorbed centuries of starlight and learned to give it back in gentle measure. One was a crystal that pulsed with blue light, another a smooth river stone that glowed with warm amber, and a third that seemed to contain tiny galaxies swirling in its depths. The elf began to hum, her voice weaving harmonies that seemed to make the very air shimmer with possibility, melodies that existed at the edge of hearing and the center of feeling. Her song had no words, but needed none, speaking directly to the part of the soul that understood beauty without analysis, that responded to music the way flowers respond to sunlight. The melodies seemed to draw responses from the night itself. Insects began to chirp in rhythm. Water lapped against the shore in time with the beat, and even the stars seemed to pulse more brightly in harmony with her voice. The southern traveler opened a small wooden box that released the scent of spices and distant seas, filling the night with dreams of places where the sun painted the sand gold and the wind carried stories from the edges of the world. The fragrances that emerged spoke of cinnamon and cardamom, of roses dried under desert suns and tea leaves that had been blessed by mountain springs, of incense burned in temples where prayers were offered not in desperation, but in gratitude for the beauty that filled every moment for those who had learned how to see. Together, they sat by the river's edge while the water lapped against the stones with the patient rhythm of a sleeping breath, creating a sound like the gentlest of lullabies. No one spoke of destinations or purposes, of reasons for traveling or hopes for what lay ahead. Instead, they shared the deeper communion of those who understood that some journeys were not about arriving, but about the transformation that occurred in the walking, the gradual shedding of everything that was not essential until only the true self remained. The dwarf's presence brought the solid comfort of mountains and deep halls carved from living rock, of fires that burned steady and warm in hearths made of stone that had been shaped by patient hands. There was something infinitely reassuring about his stillness, his rootedness, his connection to the deep places of the earth where gems formed over centuries and rivers carved their paths through bedrock with the persistence of water that knew no hurry. The elf song carried the memory of forests so ancient they remembered when the world was young, when the first trees learned to reach toward light and the first flowers discovered color. Her music spoke of seasons turning in their eternal dance, of life and death and rebirth woven together in patterns too beautiful and complex for any single mind to grasp completely. Listening to her voice was like remembering something that had been forgotten, but never lost, like coming home to a place that existed outside of geography. The Southern traveler's stories, told without words in the mingling of scents from his traveling box, spoke of horizons that stretched beyond the edge of maps and the beauty found in places where the familiar gave way to wonder. Each fragrance carried memories of markets where languages mixed like spices, of caravans that crossed deserts under stars that seemed close enough to pluck like fruit, of oases where water was more precious than gold, and shade was a gift from gods who understood the value of relief. As the night deepened around them, they rose as if responding to some signal only they could hear and began to follow the river downstream. The water had carved a path between gentle hills that rose like sleeping animals on either side, their slopes covered with grass, so soft it seemed to glow with its own faint light. The way was easy here, the stones worn smooth by countless travelers' feet, each step forward a meditation on the pleasure found in purposeful movement through beautiful country. The group moved together with the natural coordination of those who had traveled together for years, though they had met only moments before. The dwarf set the pace with his steady, measured steps. The elf danced alongside with movements that seemed to echo the rhythm of wind through leaves, and the southern traveler strode forward with the confident gait of one who knew that every horizon promised new wonders for those brave enough to seek them. The hills grew taller as they walked, but their slopes remained gentle, inviting rather than challenging, covered with vegetation that seemed to welcome travelers rather than hinder them. Scattered across these rolling heights, they began to notice flowers unlike any that grew in daylight gardens, blooms that challenged everything they thought they knew about the natural world and the boundaries between the possible and the magical. These flowers held light within their petals, not the fierce brightness of flames that hurt the eyes and cast harsh shadows, but the soft glow of stars that had been taught to grow in gardens, that had learned to bloom with luminescence instead of color alone. Some flickered like candles in a gentle breeze, their light waxing and waning in rhythm with their own mysterious pulse. Others maintained a steady radiance that seemed to come from some inexhaustible source of peace, glowing with the same constant warmth as a fire built from woods that never burned completely away. Still others pulsed with the slow rhythm of sleeping hearts, their light growing bright, and then dim in a pattern that spoke of life and breath, and the patient circulation of energy through systems more complex than any mechanism ever devised by human hands. The effect of thousands of these flowers scattered across the hillsides was like looking at a terrestrial galaxy, a constellation that had come down from the sky to rest on Earth and share its light with travelers who had learned to walk in darkness without fear. The companions climbed among these lantern flowers, following pathways that seemed to light themselves as they approached, each bloom recognizing their presence and responding with slightly brighter radiance before settling back to its baseline glow as they moved on. It was as if the flowers were passing them from one to the next in a relay of welcome, ensuring that no step of their journey would be taken in true darkness, that they would always have just enough light to see their way forward without being overwhelmed by illumination too bright for the peaceful journey they were undertaking. At the crest of one hill, they paused to rest among a grove of these remarkable plants, settling into grass that felt softer than the finest silk and smelled of rain and growing things and something else, something that might have been the fragrance of starlight distilled into perfume. Here the flowers grew larger and more varied, some as big as dinner plates with petals that seemed to be made of crystallized moonlight, others small as coins but glowing with intensity that made up for their size. The dwarf ran his fingers along the petals of a nearby bloom, and it responded by painting his weathered face with gentle shadows and highlights, transforming his features into something almost ethereal while never losing the fundamental kindness that lived in his eyes. The light seemed to reveal layers of his character that daylight had never shown. The poet that lived alongside the craftsman, the dreamer that walked hand in hand with the practical engineer of stone and metal. The elf settled beside a cluster of smaller flowers that began to pulse in time with her breathing, creating a visual echo of her life force that spread outward in waves of soft illumination, connecting her to the plants around her in patterns that spoke of the deep kinship between all living things. As she breathed in, the flowers glowed brighter, and as she exhaled, their light softened to match the rhythm of her own internal tides, creating a light-based symphony that was both deeply personal and universally beautiful. The Southern traveler arranged several of the fallen petals and patterns around their resting place, and the group watched in wonder as the designs began to glow more brightly, creating mandalas of light that seemed to pulse with meaning just beyond the edge of understanding. The patterns he created spoke of mathematical relationships that existed in nature, of the spiral arrangements that governed everything from seashells to galaxies, of the hidden geometries that connected all beautiful things across the vast reaches of space and time. They shared food that tasted of starlight and water that carried the essence of mountain springs, each bite and sip adding to the growing sense that they were no longer entirely in the world they had known, but transitioning into something altogether more magical, more alive with possibility, more responsive to the deepest desires of hearts that had learned to seek beauty over comfort, wonder over security, truth over convenience. The bread they ate seemed to contain sunshine and rain and the patient labor of hands that had kneaded love into every loaf. The fruit burst with flavors that spoke of orchards where trees grew for centuries without hurrying, where each season added layers of complexity to the simple sweetness that came from earth and water and time. The water they drank tasted of snow that had never melted until this moment, of springs that rose from depths where pressure and heat had purified every molecule until it became not just liquid, but liquid peace, liquid refreshment for souls that had traveled far and still had farther to go. When they finally laid down to rest, the lantern flowers around them dimmed to the perfect level for sleeping, bright enough to keep the darkness from feeling empty or threatening, soft enough not to disturb their dreams with harsh illumination. The grass beneath them felt like the finest bedding that had ever been prepared for weary travelers, supporting their bodies with exactly the right combination of softness and firmness, warmth and coolness, familiarity and strangeness that allowed them to feel completely at ease in this place that was like no place they had ever been before. The night air carried the scent of growing things and distant snow and something else, something that smelled like peace itself distilled in a fragrance, like the essence of all the moments in their lives when they had felt perfectly content, perfectly at home, perfectly aligned with the deep rhythms of existence that usually remained hidden beneath the surface noise of daily concerns. Their dreams, when they came, were unlike any they had experienced before, filled with landscapes that existed only in the realm of sleep and stories, populated by creatures made of light and music, and the kind of beauty that could only be fully experienced when the rational mind had stepped aside to let the soul see clearly. The Hobbit found himself walking through halls made of crystallized music, where every surface sang with harmonies that had been growing more beautiful for centuries, where the walls themselves were composed of frozen symphonies and the floors rang with melodies that had been walked into existence by countless feet dancing to rhythms older than recorded history. The dwarf dreamed of caverns filled with gems that were not stones but crystallized laughter, each one holding the memory of every moment of joy that had ever been experienced in the depths of the earth, every celebration that had echoed through underground halls, every song that had been sung by voices that understood the acoustics of stone and the way sound could be shaped by space into something more beautiful than the sum of its parts. The elf's sleep was filled with trees that grew not upward toward light, but inward toward essence, their roots and branches weaving through dimensions of possibility to create gardens that existed in the spaces between seconds, forests that grew in the pauses between heartbeats, groves where time moved differently, and every leaf was a doorway to understanding that could not be reached through thinking alone, but only through the kind of seeing that came from being perfectly present to whatever was unfolding in each eternal moment. The southern traveler's dreams carried him across deserts made of ground starlight, where each grain of sand held a tiny universe, and the wind sang with the voices of every soul that had ever gazed at the night sky and wondered what lay beyond the visible horizon. What possibilities existed in the vast spaces between the stars? What stories were being told in languages of light and gravity and the slow dance of celestial bodies through the infinite darkness that was also infinite light, depending on how you learned to look at it. But running through all their individual visions was a common thread. The presence of the mountain, always ahead, always calling, its stone heart beating with a rhythm that seemed to sync with their own pulses, their own breathing, their own deep need for something that could not be named but could be felt in the bones and the blood, in the part of the soul that remembered what it had been like before it learned to worry about anything other than the next breath, the next step, the next moment. Of simple existence in a world that was far more beautiful and far more welcoming than the stories of struggle and scarcity would have them believe. In their dreams, they could see that the mountain was not empty, not lonely despite its name, but filled with a presence so vast and gentle that it could hold all their seeking, all their weariness, all their hope for something better than what the ordinary world could offer. The mountain was not a destination to be reached, but a state of being to be entered. Not a place on any map, but a condition of the heart that could be accessed wherever they were, whenever they remembered how to stop seeking and start receiving, how to stop struggling and start trusting that everything they needed was already present, already available, already waiting for the moment when they were ready to come home to themselves. They woke as dawn touched the edges of the world with fingers of pale gold. But the light seemed different here, softer and more forgiving than the harsh illumination of everyday mornings that demanded immediate attention and urgent action. This dawn crept across the sky like honey poured over silk, transforming the darkness not by banishing it, but by embracing it, showing that light and shadow could exist together in perfect harmony, each one making the other more beautiful by contrast. The lantern flowers had not ceased their glowing with the coming of day, but had instead modulated their light to blend with the sunrise, creating an effect like being inside a living jewel where natural and supernatural illumination dance together in patterns too complex and beautiful for any single mind to follow completely. The flowers seemed to understand that dawn was not the end of their purpose, but simply another movement in the symphony of light they had been composing throughout the night. They broke their fast on fruits that seemed to have absorbed the essence of the light flowers, each bite filling them with gentle energy that felt more like contentment than the restless vitality of ordinary food. The berries burst with flavors that spoke of sunshine distilled in a sweetness, of rain that had learned to taste like joy, of earth that had discovered how to nurture not just growth, but actual happiness in everything it touched. The bread was soft as clouds and filling as hope, and the water they shared tasted of springs that bubbled up from the heart of the world itself. As they prepared to continue their journey, folding away the few possessions they carried and stretching muscles that felt refreshed rather than stiff from their night on the ground, the dwarf pointed toward the horizon where the lonely mountain now loomed so large it seemed to fill half the sky. Its slopes, which from a distance had appeared uniformly gray, now revealed themselves to be painted in subtle shades that changed with each shift of light. Blue deep as ocean trenches, purple rich as royal velvet, green soft as new leaves, silver bright as moonlight on water. The mountain no longer looked like a distant destination, but like something they were already beginning to enter, as if the space between them and its base was an illusion that would dissolve with each step forward, as if the journey toward the mountain was really a journey into it, a gradual passage from the world of ordinary concerns into the realm where stone held dreams and silence spoke louder than words ever could. The path began to climb more steeply now, winding through terrain that grew more extraordinary with each turn. But the effort required felt different from ordinary exertion. Instead of depleting their strength, each upward step seemed to fill them with more energy, as if the mountain itself were lending them the power needed for ascent, as if their muscles were being fed by sources of strength they had never known they possessed. The air grew thinner, but somehow richer, carrying scents of stone and crystal, and something that might have been the fragrance of crystallized time itself. The smell of moments that had been preserved in rock and ice in the deep places where the planet stored its memories. Each breath seemed to clear their minds rather than strain their lungs, filling them with clarity instead of exhaustion, with peace instead of the desperate gasping that usually accompanied difficult climbs. As they climbed, the world behind them began to fade into a soft haze, not disappearing, but becoming dreamlike, as if it were transforming from reality into memory, from fact into story. The lantern hills became points of distant light, twinkling like stars that had fallen to earth and learned to grow in gardens. The forest they had passed through melted into a green smudge on the horizon, its details softened by distance until it looked like something painted by an artist who specialized in capturing the essence of places rather than their exact appearance. Even the river that had shown them visions became nothing more than a silver thread catching the light, a ribbon of brightness that connected their past to their present and suggested pathways to futures they could not yet imagine. It wasn't that these places were vanishing, but rather that they were taking their proper place in the larger story. Beautiful chapters in a tale that was leading inevitably toward whatever waited in the heart of the mountain. Stepping stones in a journey that was as much about transformation as it was about travel. The companions found themselves moving closer together as they climbed, not from fear, but from a growing sense of shared purpose that drew them into tighter formation like iron filings responding to a magnet. Their individual stories were weaving together into something larger, their separate quests revealing themselves to be facets of a single greater seeking that none of them could have accomplished alone, but all of them together might just be able to fulfill. The dwarf's knowledge of stone and the deep places of the earth, learned through centuries of working with rock and metal and the patient arts of crafting beauty from raw materials, helped him read the story written in the mountain's layers and formations, understanding the geological poetry that spoke of pressure and time and the slow transformation of simple elements into structures of incredible complexity and strength. The elf's understanding of growth and the patience of ancient things, her connection to the rhythms that governed everything from the smallest seed to the largest tree, let her sense how the mountain lived and breathed and changed, despite its appearance of eternal stillness. She could feel its pulse, slow and deep as the turning of seasons, could sense the life that moved through it in patterns too vast for human perception, but perfectly comprehensible to those who had learned to think in terms of centuries rather than moments. The southern traveler's wisdom about the vastness of the world and the small beauties that could be found in any landscape, his experience with horizons, and the way they shifted and changed depending on where you stood and how you learned to look, prepared him for the mountain scale and helped him navigate by landmarks too subtle for untrained eyes to detect. The way shadows fell differently at different altitudes. The way the air itself seemed to develop texture as they climbed higher into the realm where earth met sky, and the Hobbit's gift for seeing magic in ordinary moments. His ability to find wonder in the simple act of walking or breathing or noticing how light fell across stone allowed him to understand that what they were experiencing was not just a journey through landscape, but a passage through the physical manifestation of peace itself. A walking meditation that was transforming them, even as they transformed the mountain by the simple act of approaching it with hearts full of reverence and hope. The mountain's shadow fell over them as they approached its base, but this darkness was not the absence of light, but a different kind of illumination altogether, a quality of shade that revealed rather than concealed, that showed them colors that had no names in daylight languages and textures that could only be perceived when the harsh brightness of direct sunlight was filtered through the gentle presence of stone that had learned to moderate intensity without diminishing beauty. Here, in the shadow of stone, they could see the mountain's true face, not the forbidding cliff of gray rock they might have expected, but a wall that had been carved and shaped by wind and weather into passages and doorways, some large enough for giants to walk through upright, others perfectly sized for travelers like themselves, each one inviting rather than excluding, each one promising shelter and welcome rather than danger and difficulty. The rock face before them was a masterpiece of natural architecture, carved by forces that understood both power and subtlety, both strength and grace. Water had played a role in its shaping. They could see centuries of rain and snow and the patient work of streams that had learned to carve beauty instead of just cutting channels. Wind had contributed its own artistry, polishing surfaces to silk-smooth perfection and creating alcoves and niches that seemed designed specifically for rest and contemplation. But there was something else in the carving, something that spoke of intention beyond the merely natural, of an intelligence that worked through geological time to create not just passages, but welcome, not just openings, but invitation. The doorways were placed where they would catch the most favorable light, the passages angled to create the gentlest possible ascent, the whole structure designed with the care of architects who measured success not in efficiency, but in the peace and comfort of those who would one day walk these halls. Without discussion, they chose a doorway that seemed to pulse with gentle warmth, its opening framed by stones that had been worn smooth by countless hands, polished by the touch of travelers who had passed this way before them and left behind the accumulated blessing of their gratitude, made manifest in the very texture of the stone. As they approached, they could feel heat radiating from the opening. Not the harsh heat of fire, but the gentle warmth of stones that had been sitting in sunlight, of places where comfort was built into the very architecture. As they stepped across the threshold, passing from the external world into the internal realm of the mountain, they felt a shift that was more than physical, a sense of entering not just a different place, but a different state of being, where the rules that governed ordinary experience gave way to laws more ancient and more forgiving, more responsive to the deep needs of souls that had traveled far in search of peace. The mountain welcomed them not with echoes and emptiness, not with the harsh acoustics of hollow spaces and barren stone, but with the soft susurrus of air moving through vast spaces, carrying with it the suggestion of halls so large they might contain their own weather, their own seasons of stone and silence, their own gentle climate created by the interaction of temperature and humidity and the patient breathing of rock that had learned to live in harmony with the creatures that sheltered. Within its embrace, the passages within the mountain were nothing like the cramped, dangerous tunnels they might have imagined. Nothing like the narrow caves that existed in stories designed to frighten rather than comfort. Instead, they found themselves walking through corridors wide as city streets, their walls carved with patterns that seemed to shift and flow in their peripheral vision. Designs that were too complex to follow with the conscious mind, but perfectly comprehensible to the part of the soul that understood beauty without needing to analyze it. Light came from everywhere and nowhere. Not torches or lanterns that would create harsh circles of illumination surrounded by equally harsh darkness, but a gentle radiance that seemed to emerge from the stone itself, as if the mountain had been storing light for countless centuries and was now releasing it in gentle measures for the comfort of travelers who had learned to walk in darkness without losing their way. The illumination was warm without being hot, bright without being glaring, steady without being static. It pulsed gently, like a heartbeat made of light, creating rhythms that synchronized with their own breathing and footsteps until they began to feel that they were not just walking through the mountain, but becoming part of it, joining their small rhythms to its vast slow pulse, their brief lives to its eternal patience. The air inside was neither cold nor warm, but perfectly temperate, carrying the clean scent of stone that had been washed by centuries of underground streams and the faint mineral taste of deep earth, of places where water had dissolved and recrystallized the very bones of the world until every breath they took was flavored with the essence of geological time, with the taste of patience made tangible. Their footsteps, instead of echoing harshly in the way they would have expected in stone passages, seemed to be absorbed by the mountain and transformed into something like music. Not melody exactly, but rhythm, a percussion that matched their heartbeats and breathing until it became impossible to tell where they ended and the mountain began, where their small human rhythms joined the vast, slow symphony that the mountain had been composing since the day it first rose from the earth. They passed chambers that opened off the main corridor like rooms in an infinite house, each one designed for a different purpose, each one beautiful in its own way, each one offering a different kind of rest or contemplation or simple wonder of the artistry that could emerge from the partnership between intention and time, between vision and the patient forces that knew how to transform vision into reality. Some chambers were filled with formations that looked like frozen waterfalls, their calcified cascades gleaming in the stone light like silk scarves thrown by dancers and caught at the perfect moment of their flight. Others contained pools of water so still and clear they seemed like windows into other worlds, their surfaces reflecting not just the ceiling above, but something else, something that might have been other skies, other possibilities, other versions of the story they were living. One vast hall stretched so far into the distance that they could not see its end, its ceiling supported by columns that looked like trees made of marble, each one unique in its detailing, each one perfect in its balance of strength and grace, each one growing from floor to ceiling in spirals and curves that spoke of organic intelligence, of stone that had learned to grow like living wood, reaching toward light that came from within rather than from above. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about these spaces was the silence. Not the dead quiet of empty places that made every sound seem harsh and intrusive, but the living silence of somewhere that was full of presence, full of waiting, full of patient attention that had been accumulating for centuries and was now focused on welcoming them home. It was the silence of deep forests where every tree was listening, of still lakes where every ripple carried meaning, of mountaintops that had stood unchanged while civilizations rose and fell in the valleys below, accumulating wisdom with each passing season. It was silence that held rather than excluded, that embraced rather than intimidated, that created space for their own inner voices to emerge from beneath the constant chatter of daily concerns and speak the deeper truths that could only be heard when the world grew quiet enough for the soul to remember its own language, its own songs, its own reasons for being. As they walked deeper into the mountain, following passages that seemed to know where they were leading even when the travelers themselves did not, they began to hear something that might have been singing, though it existed at the very edge of perception, in the space between sound and silence where the most beautiful music always lived. It seemed to come from the stone itself, a harmony so deep and slow that individual notes might last for days, creating music that existed in geological time, that measured its rhythms not in beats per minute, but in seasons per movement, years per phrase. The song seemed to be telling the story of the mountain's creation, of the long ages when fire and pressure had shaped these halls, of the patient centuries when water had carved and polished and perfected every surface, of the countless years when wind had whispered through passages and left its own contribution to the architecture, smoothing rough edges and creating alcoves where the acoustics were perfect for rest and reflection. It was the song of stone learning to sing, of mineral learning to make music, of the earth itself discovering that it could create beauty not just for its own satisfaction, but for the comfort of small creatures who needed shelter and welcome and the deep peace that came from being held by something larger and more stable than their own brief lives, something that had existed long before they were born and would continue long after they were gone, something that could hold their small stories within its vast narrative and make them part of something eternal. The companions found themselves walking in rhythm with this stone song, their steps becoming part of its ancient meter, their breathing joining the vast, slow inhalation and exhalation of the mountain itself. They no longer felt like visitors in an alien place, but like notes being added to a composition that had been incomplete without them, like instruments joining an orchestra that had been waiting centuries for exactly their voices, their particular contributions to the symphony that could only be complete when all the right souls had found their way home. The dwarf's knowledge of deep places helped him read the story written in the stone's layers and formations, understanding the text that was spelled out in veins of different minerals, in a way crystals had grown in water, had flowed, and pressure had compressed and released across the centuries. He could see the mountain's autobiography written in stone, could read the chapters that told of its youth when it was still growing, its maturity when it learned to shelter others, its present patience as it waited for each new traveler to discover what they needed to find. The elf's sensitivity to growing things let her understand how the mountain lived and breathed and changed, despite its appearance of eternal stillness. She could feel the slow circulation of air through its passages, the way moisture moved through its pores, the subtle shifts and adjustments it made to accommodate the seasons and the weather and the small creatures that made their homes in its embrace. To her, the mountain was not a static thing, but a slow-growing entity, expanding its consciousness and its capacity for comfort with each passing year. The southern traveler's experience with vast spaces prepared him for the mountain scale and helped him navigate by landmarks too subtle for untrained eyes. The way shadows fell differently at different levels. The way the stone light changed its quality as they moved deeper into the heart of the mountain. The way the air itself developed different textures and flavors that marked their progress along paths that existed in 3 dimensions but were navigated by senses that operated in 4 or 5 or however many dimensions were needed to find the way home. And the Hobbit's gift for finding wonder in unexpected places allowed him to see that what they were experiencing was not just a journey through stone, but a passage through the physical manifestation of peace itself, a walking meditation that was transforming them even as they moved, teaching them that rest was not something they had to earn, but something that was available in every step, every breath, every moment when they remembered to stop seeking and start receiving what was already there, already waiting, already perfect. The corridors began to slope downward, leading them deeper into the mountain's heart through passages that felt less like tunnels and more like the chambers of some vast organism, some living entity that had learned to think in stone and dream in crystal and love in the patient accumulation of comfort across geological time. The walls here were smoother, almost organic in their curves, flowing like water that had been frozen at the moment of perfect grace, like silk that had been carved from living rock. The light took on a warmer quality as they descended, shifting from the cool radiance of starlight to something that reminded them of sunset seen through amber, of candlelight filtered through honey, of the gentle glow that came from fires built from woods that burned with more warmth and heat, more comfort than intensity. They began to feel a pull ahead of them, not the urgent summons of danger or desire, but the gentle attraction of something that had been waiting for them with infinite patience, something that had known they would come long before they knew it themselves, something that had been preparing a welcome across the centuries. The passage opened suddenly into a chamber, so large they could not see its walls or ceiling, filled with a light that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Not the harsh illumination that created sharp shadows and hurt the eyes, but a gentle radiance that seemed to emerge from the air itself, from the space between atoms, from the quantum foam where light and matter danced together in patterns too beautiful for ordinary perception to follow. At the center of this impossible space, they found what they had been seeking without knowing they were seeking it, a pool of water that glowed with its own inner radiance, its surface perfectly still, yet somehow alive with movement, like liquid starlight contained within invisible shores, like captured moonlight that had learned to flow like water while maintaining all its luminous properties. The pool was neither large nor small, but exactly the right size, its dimensions somehow perfect for the space it occupied and the purpose it served and the number of souls who would gather around it at this moment in time. Its edges were defined not by constructed walls, but by the natural formation of the stone floor, as if the mountain had shaped this chamber specifically to hold this particular body of water, as if the pool had always been part of the original design, as essential to the mountain's purpose as the halls and passages that led to it. Around the pool, the stone had formed natural seats, each one perfectly sized for a different member of their group, each one positioned at exactly the right angle to the water and the light and the subtle currents of air that moved through the chamber. It was as if the mountain had known they were coming and had prepared a place for them across the centuries, carving these seats with the same patient attention to detail that had shaped every other aspect of their welcome. They settled into these seats with the profound relief of travelers who had finally arrived, not just at their destination, but at their true home, not just at the end of their journey, but at the beginning of their real life. the life they had been preparing for without knowing it through all the years of seeking and wandering and never quite finding what they were looking for in any of the places they had looked before. The water in the pool reflected not their faces but their hearts, showing them not what they looked like on the surface, but who they truly were beneath all the layers of doubt and seeking and unfulfilled longing that had accumulated like dust on mirrors, obscuring their true nature until they had almost forgotten what it meant to see themselves clearly, to recognize themselves as they actually were rather than as they thought they should be. The Hobbit saw himself as he was meant to be, not someone who was too small for the world's grand adventures, but someone whose very ordinariness was a kind of magic, whose ability to find wonder in simple things was exactly the gift the world needed most, whose willingness to seek comfort over conquest was not weakness, but the deepest kind of wisdom. The understanding that true treasure was not something to be won, but something to be received with gratitude and shared with joy. The dwarf saw the strength that came not from hardness, but from the patient endurance that could weather any storm and still find reasons for joy, still discover beauty in the process of creation, still take pleasure in the simple act of shaping raw materials into forms that served and comforted and pleased the eye and the heart. He saw that his craft was not just about making things, but about making things that mattered, about adding to the world's store of beauty and utility and the kind of solid comfort that came from knowing that some things were built to last, built to shelter, built to endure. The elf recognized her connection to the eternal cycles of growth and rest, death and renewal, that made her not separate from the world, but woven into its deepest patterns, part of the vast web of relationships that connected every living thing to every other living thing across time and space. She saw that her song was not just her own, but part of the great chorus that had been singing since the world began, adding her voice to harmonies that would continue long after her individual notes had faded into the eternal music that held everything together. The Southern traveler understood that his wandering had not been escape from belonging, but preparation for it, learning to find home in the journey itself so that he could help others do the same, discovering that every horizon was both an ending and a beginning, that every destination was both a place to rest and a place to start again. That the real treasure of travel was not the places you saw, but the capacity you developed for seeing, for appreciating, for finding wonder wherever you happen to be. But more than individual recognition, they experienced the profound peace of being exactly where they were supposed to be, doing exactly what they were meant to do, in the company of exactly the right companions, at exactly the right moment in the vast unfolding of time. The mountains' heart beat around them with the slow rhythm of geological time, and they felt their own hearts beginning to match that ancient pulse, their breathing slowing to sync with the mountain's eternal respiration, their thoughts settling into the deep stillness that was not emptiness but fullness, not vacancy but presence, not the absence of activity, but the presence of peace so complete that activity became unnecessary. The pool before them began to sing, not with voices, but with the sound water makes when it has been transformed into pure music, when every molecule has learned to vibrate in harmony with every other molecule, when the simple act of existing becomes a form of worship, a celebration of the miracle that allows matter to exist at all, that allows consciousness to arise from complexity, that allows beauty to emerge from the patient interaction of simple elements across vast stretches of time. The melody was simple, just a few notes repeated in patterns that seemed to contain all the lullabies ever sung and all the peaceful silences that had ever settled over the world at the end of difficult days. It was the sound of every mother's voice soothing a frightened child, every lover's whisper promising that everything would be all right, every friend's assurance that no one had to face the darkness alone, every wise teacher's gentle reminder that peace was not something to be achieved, but something to be remembered, not something to be earned, but something to be received. They realized that this was what they had been seeking. Not treasure in the traditional sense, not gold or jewels, or any of the material things of the world taught them to desire, but the treasure of perfect rest, the wealth that came from knowing that peace was not something to be earned or achieved, but something that was always available, always waiting. In the deep places of the world and the quiet chambers of the heart, where the soul kept its most precious possessions safe from the noise and rush and constant demands of ordinary life. The lonely mountain was not lonely because it was abandoned, but because it held a solitude so complete and welcoming that it could embrace any amount of seeking, any degree of weariness, and transform them into contentment. It was lonely the way deep peace is lonely, not empty but full, not isolated but connected to everything, not separate but so unified with the whole of existence that it no longer needed the constant company of distraction and noise to feel complete. One by one, they lay down on the soft stone beside the pool, using their traveling packs as pillows, pulling their cloaks around them like blankets woven from starlight and dreams. The light from the pool painted gentle patterns on the chamber walls, creating the effect of being inside a living constellation, inside a galaxy that had learned to exist on a human scale, inside a universe that had been designed specifically for rest and peace and the deep sleep that heals not just the body but the soul. The mountain's song continued, joined now by the soft sounds of their breathing, the rustle of fabric as they settled into comfort, the small settling noises that people make when they finally allow themselves to truly rest, when they finally stop holding themselves alert for dangers that never come, when they finally trust that they are safe enough to let go completely, to surrender to sleep without reserving any part of themselves for vigilance or worry or the constant monitoring that had become such a habit they had forgotten what it felt like to be truly at ease. The Hobbit was the last to close his eyes, looking around one final time at this impossible place, at his companions who had become family without his noticing the transition, at the pool that continued to glow with patient welcome, at the walls that seemed to pulse gently with the mountain's vast, slow heartbeat. He understood now that the journey had not been about reaching the mountain, but about becoming the kind of person who could recognize peace when he found it, who could receive the gift of rest without feeling guilty about stopping, who could trust that some destinations were not endings, but new kinds of beginning, doorways into ways of being that had always been possible, but had never seemed accessible until the right moment, the right companions, the right willingness to leave everything familiar behind in search of something better. As sleep took him, he felt the mountain's ancient presence settling around them like the world's gentlest blanket, like the embrace of time itself, like the love of the earth for all the small creatures who sought shelter in its arms. The lonely mountain would keep them safe through all the hours of rest that lay ahead, its stone heart beating steadily beneath them, its halls echoing with the soft music of their dreams, its presence a guarantee that they would wake not just refreshed, but transformed, not just rested, but renewed, not just peaceful, but permanently changed by the experience of being held by something so much larger and more stable and more generous than anything they had ever imagined possible. They had found what they were seeking, and in finding it, They have become what the mountain was seeking: souls at peace, hearts at rest, spirits finally home. And if you have followed this tale to its end, dear listener, perhaps you have found something too. Perhaps you have discovered that peace is not a destination to be reached, but a recognition to be made, not a reward for completing some difficult journey, but a gift that waits in the quiet moments when you finally allow yourself to stop seeking and start receiving what has been there all along, waiting patiently for the moment when you are ready to come home to yourself. The lonely mountain exists wherever you are willing to find it, in the space between thoughts, in the pause between breaths, in the moment when you realize that everything you need for perfect rest has been with you all along, built into the very structure of your being, as natural and available as breathing, as simple and profound as the decision to stop fighting and start trusting, to stop searching and start receiving, to stop trying so hard to earn what can only be given freely, what is always being offered, what waits with infinite patience for the moment when you are finally ready to say yes. Let the mountain's song carry you now into whatever dreams await, and know that in the deep places of sleep, you too can find the halls of peace that have been carved by time and patience in the bedrock of being itself. Rest now, traveler. The mountain will keep watch while you sleep, and in the morning, whenever your morning comes, you will wake not as someone who has escaped the world, but as someone who has learned to find the sacred hiding in the heart of the ordinary, waiting patiently for the moment when you are ready to come home, to rest, to be exactly who you are in a place that welcomes you completely, just as you are, just as you have always been, just as you will always be in the deep place where peace lives in love. Waits, and the mountain holds all seekers safe in the eternal embrace of stone and starlight and the infinite patience of the earth itself.